Morning, class. Welcome to the next part of our cells and organelles series. Um, Today, we're going to really focus on the cells themselves and what you might find inside of them, and the functions that each of those things that we find inside the cells, which are called, remember, organelles, and what they do. So our learning objective today, understanding the structure of cells and how they carry out their functions with organelles. Just a real quick recap. So if we take a look at this animal cell, all of the things inside of the cell are these things that we call organelles. And there's a lot going on here. You're not going to need to know every single one of them. But just know that they're all called organelles and they all have different functions, right? And without these organelles, which are kind of like our organs, the cell couldn't do anything, right? And they all have their own function, which is what we're going to talk about today, okay? So don't worry about everything on this page. I'll tell you which ones we're going to talk about. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is in an animal cell, we're talking about cytoplasm. And we're going to talk about the difference between an animal cell and a plant cell later on. But first thing, we're going to talk about cytoplasm, which is the fluid part of a cell. And I used a simpler diagram rather than what I showed you on the previous slide to show you that. Because if you look at cytoplasm, it's pointing to this empty space right here, right? The cytoplasm is kind of what holds the organelles in place, and that's why in each one of these organelles, I'm going to give you guys a two-word definition, right? And this one's specifically called the organelle holder. And what I can do is I'm going to draw it out for you guys a little easier here. So if you say you're in like, you have a massive swimming pool, right? Massive swimming pool. This is going to be our cell, okay? And in that cell, or swimming pool, we have the cytoplasm, right? And so that's going to be like this orangey, fluidy stuff, right? Well, what we would call probably the water, right? The water in the swimming pool, but it's orange this time, okay? That's all around. It's everywhere in the swimming pool. Wherever you go in the swimming pool, it's going to be there, right? And so if you throw in some stuff, maybe you throw in like a big blue ball or something that's going to be floating on top. Maybe you're swimming around in it. Sorry. Maybe you're swimming around in it. You're somewhere down here swimming through the pool, okay? But if you stop moving, right? If the ball stops moving, so maybe we have some of those rings you throw to the bottom, down. Ooh, gosh, sorry. Undo that. Maybe you have some of those rings you throw that you have to dive for at the bottom of the pool. No matter what, now imagine instead of water being in this pool, it's just jello. It's an orange jello. Are you going to be able to just float around? No. All these things in this swimming pool are going to be held in place wherever they are, right? So that's what we have in the cytoplasm, right? The cytoplasm is this kind of thicker fluid that holds the organelles in place. And if it wasn't for the cytoplasm, they'd just be floating around, bumping into each other, probably causing some damage, right? Cool. So that's cytoplasm. Remember, organelle holder. Moving on to the nucleus. You guys have probably heard of this term before, whether or not it's in the terms of cells. The nucleus is the control center. Right, look down here. We have the two-word definition. It's called the control center. And it's the nucleus. It contains something called DNA, which we'll talk about loads of over the course of science. But it contains DNA and a eukaryotic cell, which is something we talked about last time, right? Eukaryotic cells are basically anything that have these organelles. So if we were to take a look back at this this diagram I had at the start of the slideshow, the nucleus here, you can see it with this big red circle, and has a bunch of other things inside of it, but it's this big purple thing right in the middle of the cell. And so it contains DNA, and its main goal is to create proteins and basically to tell the cell what to do, right? So that's why we call it the control center, okay? So quick comprehension check, make sure you guys put these in your science copies. What is the control center of the cell? Just talked about it. And then write down what is the two-word definition of cytoplasm, okay? Two pretty easy questions. So real quickly, we'll talk about the nucleolus, which is inside of the nucleus. So if you have the nucleus here, inside of it is called the nucleolus, which is this big, like darker purple in the center of the nucleus. And it's where these things called ribosomes are made or manufactured, which is what we're going to talk about next, okay? So ribosomes, So if you have proteins, they need to be made by something, right? And that's where these ribosomes come in. And so take a look at our two-word definition down here. Protein producers. Producers means that you're making something, right? If you produce chairs, right? You're making chairs, right? You're making them and then they're going out and people are using them, right? So ribosomes, there's a lot of words here, and we have free ribosomes, which it says function unattached in the cytoplasm. So they're just floating, kind of floating around in the cell. Now, if you kind of look at my diagram over here again of the pool, right? Some things are fixed in place. So if this big blue blob right here is, say, it's the nucleus, right? Then you might have a bunch of, let's use a different color here. Let's use maybe a green for these ribosomes that are kind of all around. They're a lot smaller than anything else. They're all around the pool or the cell, right? And they're able to kind of move around. The nucleus isn't going to move. Some of the other organelles, which you might stand for here, aren't really going to move around. But the ribosomes, they're probably going to move around, okay? Okay. So if we're switching back here, okay? So the ribosomes here then, so we have, like I said, free ribosomes that kind of float around the cell, and then we have bound ribosomes. Don't worry about this term endoplasmic reticulum yet, but just know that bound ribosomes, they are bound to a specific organelle in the cell, okay? And then obviously if ribosomes, if they make proteins, if they produce proteins, they're going to be found in higher numbers in cells that make a lot of proteins, which the pancreas is one of those things, right? So if you need to make a lot of proteins, you're going to need more ribosomes, okay? So this is kind of what they might look like, and this is kind of what they look like in real life, right? So if you zoom really far into a cell, you might be able to find some ribosomes. Notice that the free ones are just kind of floating around this empty space here, and the bound ribosomes are kind of hooked onto these walls here, okay? So that's where you might find ribosomes in that diagram. You see they're kind of hooked on, so there's some that are hooked on to this blue wall here, and then there's some that are kind of floating around this empty space right here. So comprehension check, where are bound ribosomes found? That answers in a previous slide. And where is the nucleolus found? Again, all in a previous slide. So now we have the mitochondria. Really important when it comes to talking about cells. A lot of the time you might have heard it called the powerhouse of the cell, the energy factory of the cell, but the biggest thing that you guys need to know is that food reacts with oxygen to create energy. This is called respiration. So what the mitochondria does is it takes in food, it takes in oxygen, right? We need that, right? We need to breathe and we need to eat to survive, right? So your mitochondria takes everything that you're taking in. If you eat a burger and then you take a breath, the mitochondria takes that into itself, and I'll show you here on the, so if it kind of gets into the cell through its cell membrane, right? Kind of finds its way in, and it goes into the mitochondria, and it uses food and oxygen, puts it through something called respiration. So if I bring you back over to my diagram over here, we're going to go ahead and clear all this out. So I need a new document, yeah. Ooh. So if we have our, so say this is our mitochondria, right? And it's inside the cell. So oxygen, so I'm gonna, O2 is oxygen. It's going to come into the cell, and it's going to come into the mitochondria, yeah? Same with food. I'm just going to write food. Oop, food, there we go. It's going to come in through the cell and into the mitochondria. We'll call this the cell, yeah, cell. And this is the mitochondria. I'm just going to write MIT, mitochondria, right? Oxygen, and food come into the mitochondria, and then out, oh, that's why out, it produces, it produces, oops, come on, energy, okay? Oxygen, food, in, does a bunch of stuff in here, ooh, this is called respiration, goes through something called respiration, and out comes energy, okay? Okay. All right, so back to our slides here. So we know what mitochondria do. know where they're found. So if you look at this cell diagram, they're here, this big orange thing, okay? And so if you think about it, certain cells that might need a lot of energy will have more mitochondria, right? The more mitochondria you have, the more energy you can produce. So think about it. Where in the body would you find more mitochondria than others? And think about, hint, where in the body it needs a lot of energy, right? So take a second. I'm not going to make this comprehension. Maybe pause the video for a second. Think about it. Write it down on the side and see if you get it right. So pause. So if the body, certain portions of your body need a lot of energy. Think about things that are always moving, right? I'm moving my arms, I'm moving my legs right now, you can't see. Your heart's consistently pumping no matter what happens, your heart is always pumping. Those are all ran by muscles. Muscles need a lot of energy because they need to move heavy things, right? So muscles, especially your heart, because it never stops, and if it stops, what happens if your heart stops? You know, it's not good. Your so your muscle cells, anything that, so we have skin cells, right? We have brain cells or nerve cells, right? We have all different kinds of cells. Your muscle cells, the things that make up your muscles, need a lot of mitochondria. Okay, moving on then. So then we have plant cells, right? So this is everything I've been talking about right now is found in all of this stuff back through here is found in animal cells. So we're going to talk about plant cells because they're a little different. And if you take a look, what I want you guys to do is, again, pause the video for a second. Look at this diagram. Compare it to the last diagram here, to this animal cell. What do you see is different? What do you see there that you don't find in the other ones, okay? Take a second. Again, write it down, pause the video, and see what you can find. And we'll talk about that at the end of the video, okay? All right, so we have these big things in the center here, this big white thing called a central vacuole, or we're just gonna call it a vacuole right now. There's a bunch of different kinds. We have food vacuoles, contractile vacuoles, but I wanna talk about this one here at the bottom called a central vacuole. They're membrane-bound sacs, so they're just kind of, imagine a water balloon, right? You stuff a water balloon into a cell, that's kind of what they are. And their main function of a vacuole is the storage of food and water. And there are two-word definition we can use. It's a storage unit. Just like you might have a storage unit to store a bunch of extra stuff you might have. That's kind of what the vacuole is. If you go back to this slide, all that's in here is maybe some food and water, because plants can't really move around whenever they want to go find themselves like a chipper or food or whatever it might be. They can't really do that, right? They're fixed in place. So when they get food and water, they have to store it for a little while until they can use it later on, right? So the main function of a vacuole for our purposes right now is a storage of food and water. And the two-word definition is a storage unit, okay? This is just another one. This is an actual plant cell, right? We have chloroplast, which talk about cell wall, which talk about, don't worry about this word, tonoplast. Cytosol is the same thing as cytoplasm for our purposes. And so if you take this central vacuole out of our diagram and put it into a real looking thing, this is all it looks like. It doesn't actually look much different, right? It's just a big empty looking space. And all that's in here is food and water. Okay, now we're going to talk about chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are incredibly important to plant cells because they make a plant's food. Rather than going out and finding food, they kind of take some parts. They take water and they breathe in something called carbon dioxide out of the air, and they pull that all into themselves. They can breathe, and then they make their own food right with it inside of their cells, and that all happens in these things called chloroplasts. So that's why our two-word definition is a food maker. And they're only found in plant cells. So that's one answer to the question I asked you guys earlier. What is the difference between a plant and animal cell? Chloroplast is one. You will not find chloroplasts in an animal cell. So if we take a look at our diagram here, chloroplasts are these green looking things, right? That's what they might look like. Notice that there's mitochondria in a plant cell. Sometimes some plant cells have mitochondria. So one difference isn't necessarily that they don't have mitochondria, but it would be that plant cells have the chloroplast. Animal cells do not, okay? Let's keep moving. All right, so cell walls. We talked about a cell membrane, right? So if I kind of take you guys back to my diagram over here, let's get rid of some of these ones we don't need. Get a new one. Okay, so if we kind of take a look, ooh, come back. If we take a look at our cells over here, if I were to draw you guys another, so say this is an animal cell, we talked about this outside portion being called the cell membrane, right? Cell membrane, okay? So if this is an animal cell, animal, my handwriting is terrible. If I were to draw you guys a plant cell, which will make it green just to make it look a little easier, okay? Plant cells kind of usually look more rigid in shape and they look more square because on the outermost portion, they have outside of their cell membrane, they have something called a cell wall, okay? So that's what this outermost, it's a little bit thicker. If I were to have drawn it with a bigger brush, cell wall, it would have been a bit thicker. And that's kind of what we see if we switch back to here. So if we were to take a look at our plant cell, you see this is a much thicker, more rigid looking shape on the outside, and that's what we call the cell wall. And so their biggest thing, their two main functions, is they protect the cell and they maintain its shape, right? So, plants don't really have to move very much, right? So they need to kind of be held up against gravity, right? Supports plant against gravity, right? So they don't fall over. So they have to have a really rigid cell wall, okay? And also it helps to maintain some water. Water is really important for plants to grow. Hopefully we all know that. So if we have this thick outer shell of a cell wall, right, that doesn't let much water out, okay? So three big things for a cell wall, rather than just a two-word definition. It protects the cell, maintains its shape, and limits water loss, okay? So just another diagram for you. Don't really worry too much about this. This is really technical. Don't need to know that yet. Okay. So last thing, today's work, after you've watched this video, there's a few things I need you guys to do. In your copies, I need you to draw and label animal cell with the following organelles in it and a plant cell, okay? And I've given you guys the organelles, so these are all the individual organelles that we're talking about. Organelles being the little organs of a cell, okay, that help it function and do things, right? Because we know the nucleus is the control center. We know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. They all have a different function. They help the cell to run, okay? So what I need you guys to do is in your copies, draw a plant cell, draw an animal cell, and label it. You can use any of the resources. I'll put this PowerPoint up on, it's already up on Google Classroom. Use the diagrams I've already given you, but you only have to include these different organelles, okay? Also circle the ones you can only find in a plant or animal cell. So if you draw something, and I gave you one already, that was the chloroplast. We know that chloroplasts are only found in plant cells. Circle that one, okay? There's only a few here, and they're mostly found in plant cells, but circle the ones you can't find. And make sure also here at the bottom, make sure you've answered all the comprehension questions, and post a picture of that or put it on a Google Doc, put that in Google Classroom. Same with this first one. I expect you guys to draw it in copy, upload it to Google Classroom, unless you want to get creative and draw things like I've been doing, okay? All right. I will talk to you guys on Monday. Thank you very much.